Hi everyone, my name is Giovanna Proença and today we're going to do the to-do app in JavaScript. So here it's the solution, okay? If you want to get the solutions to this to-do app and also an ebook on how to become a developer as fast as possible, click on the description below. So let's start. Our problem will be we're going to create the to-do, okay, in JavaScript. But we have to use 3 files here. Why? Because we have to create the structure of what is going to appear in our website in the HTML file. Then we're going to create a JavaScript file to do the things that we're going to use on the to-do app. And then we're going to create a file for the CSS. The CSS is the style of the project, okay? So first, let's start our HTML. Here in this page, there is an explanation, okay? So I suggest you to take a look on these notes from CS50 Web week 0, okay? And they explain a little about HTML. And so HTML is a markup language that defines the structure of a web page. It's interpreted by your web browser in order to display content on your screen, okay? So the idea basically it's what? We have to put this. This is something that we have to use, okay? This also is something that we have to use. And inside we're using tags. So we have the head tag and the body tag. The head tag is the part that we're going to input to say to the compiler the things that we're going to use in our code. So for example, if we're going to use a JavaScript file, we have to explain in here or the title that it's going to appear in the tab of the browser. So for example, here we have CS50, right? So this is the title. And in the body, we have the content that is going to appear in the body of the page. So everything that it's in here, okay? So basically, things that are important in here, I'm going to highlight. The page consists of nested HTML elements, such as HTML and body, each with an opening and closing tag, marked with either element for an opening and close tag element for a closing. So here we know we are seeing this, right? So for example, title here, inside, this is the title tag, inside we put something, and here it's the closing title tag. The body tag, the closing body tag, and so on and so forth, okay? So, and another thing that it's interesting is that here we have another thing. Notice how each of the inner elements is indented just a bit further than the last. While this is not necessarily required by the browser, it will be very helpful to keep this up in your code. So, for example, when we take a look on this code, we understand that the title it's inside the head, and everything, and hello world is inside the body, okay? And everything is inside the HTML tag, just by looking at the indentation. And the extra ideas we're going to check later, and here it's what I already said, that the head element will include information about your page, that it's not necessarily displayed, and the body element will contain what is actually visible to users who visit the page, okay? So let's start our HTML file. So remember, we have to initialize with this, okay? With this doc type HTML, so we have to specify this doc type HTML. And I'm going to put here, remember also we have to open and close the HTML, okay? Here it's the language, we're specifying that the language of this page is English, so let's put this here. HTML lang equals n, okay? And we have to close the HTML tag, okay? So let me save. So before saving, I'm going to create here a directory, okay? Make there to do JavaScript, and here it's where I'm going to put the files of our project, okay? These 3 files that we're going to create while we do the project. So here I'm going to save. This is going to be called task.html, okay? And we have to put inside the directory that we're going to use. So as we can see here, the CS50 ID already put some different colors for us to understand, okay? So now let's check the next part. So we have the head and the body, okay? So we have to put this. So we have the head. He already creates the closing and opening. That's a good tool from CS50 ID, okay? And the body. And what are we going to include in our head? So the head, remember, it's the non-visible, it's the information about the page that it's not necessarily displayed, okay? So here, by now, we're going to do what? We're going to put the title of the page, so what's going to appear on the tab of the browser, okay? So what's going to be the title? Remember, we're using tags. So since we're doing a to-do, I'm going to put here to-do, okay? So when we run this, it's going to appear the to-do. Okay, I'm going to HTTP run server. Oops, I have to do the CD. So CD to-do JavaScript, HTTP run server, HTTP server, sorry. I'm a little bit confused, right? So sorry. So here we put HTTP server. What is going to happen? We're going to, the compiler is going to give us a link, and when we go to this link, we can see our project. So click in task HTML, and we can see here that the title now it's to do. Okay, so this is what we did by now so far. So we give the name to do. Now I'm going to let this open because we were going to manipulate the website, and I want to show you what we're doing, okay? So now let's continue. So now let's go to the body part. So in the body, we can use multiple tags, okay? If we go here on HTML /3 schools, remember /3 schools, it's always a good source to check the documentation. So here in HTML tutorial /3 schools, we have a lot of things to check, okay? So this all will explain better. So if you want to get a heading, for example, and you don't know how to use, here they give examples, they explain how to use the headings, okay? So always take a look on this. So the heading is going to be our first part. Why? Because HTML headings are titles or subtitles that you want to display on your web page. And how are we going to start our project? We're going to start giving the title of our project, the heading. So what's going to be the heading? So let's check here. The heading, we want this to be big, okay? So we're going to use the heading 1. So let's put the try yourself, and let's check which tag we're using to the heading 1. So if you take a look here, the heading 1 is being displayed by the tags h1, okay, opening, closing h1. So that's what we're going to do. So in order to have a heading with this size here, we're going to use the h1 tag, okay? So here we're going to put h1. And what's going to be the name of our page? I'm going to call it as tasks, okay? Because we're doing a to-do and we want to check the tasks and so on and so forth. So let's rerun here, and we'll see that we have here a heading with tasks inside, okay? So now, since we're done the heading, we're going to create an ordered list to display the tasks that we're going to use, okay? This part is a little bit confusing, but if you take a look on the code and in the sources that I'm passing here, we know that we have to display, let me show you how our project is going to be. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to create this project here. We're going to display a to-do app, okay? And in here we have the heading. Here we're going to have the tasks that we're doing, okay? And here we have a form where we're going to submit the tasks in our to-do project, okay? So first, let's do this part here of putting some unordered list here that it's going to be our tasks. So how are we going to do this? To display the tasks, we're going to use the unordered list tag. So let me put here unordered list. Let me check. Unordered list HTML /3 schools. Okay. So here we can see that HTML lists allow web developers to group a set of related items in list. So here we have two types. We have an unordered list and an ordered list. An unordered list, we're going to use the UL, this tag here, okay? And inside the UL, each element of this unordered list, it's involved by this LI tag, that it's the list item tag, okay? In here, the ordered list, we're using OL for ordered list tag, okay? And we have the same idea of list item here inside, okay? So we see that the difference, it's how it is displayed. So here we are displaying as an unordered list using just this symbol of a dot in the middle of the line, okay? And here we are displaying with numbers, okay? So that's the difference between an unordered list and an ordered list. So since we saw, we don't have, the tasks are not necessarily an ordered list. So we're going to use an ordered list in our project, okay? So let us put here, so UL, and what's going to be inside. So let's check. Here we have the unordered list, okay? And inside we're going to put the list items. So let me just give an example. So for example here, I don't know, study JavaScript, and the next list item will be study HTML, and the other would be study CSS. Okay, so let's see how it's displayed in here. So this would be our unordered list if we were creating here an unordered list for our tasks, okay? But this is manually, right? As we can see here, we're creating this manually. We can just change our tasks. We cannot change our tasks in the web page. We just can change our tasks by this moment if we go to the source of the code, okay? And that's not the purpose of our problem. The purpose of our problem, as we can see here, we want to have a form, okay, where we can submit the new task that we want, okay? So in order to do this, we're going to create a form in HTML. So let me show you here. Forms, where are the forms? Here, forms. So an HTML form is used to collect user input. The user input is most often sent to a server for processing. So here we have an example. I'm going to show you the example. So when we want to create something, let me take this out to make things simpler, okay, easier to understand. So here we have an HTML form, so we can see the structure, right? The opening doc type, HTML, body, close HTML. And we have what? We have the heading that is saying here HTML forms, okay? And when we are using a form, we have here this form, okay? And we can put this the action. So the action is going to specify where the form data will be sent when you click submit, okay? So if you click the submit button, the form data will be sent to a page called this action here. This is the route, okay? So this is optional. We can use this or not. In our case, we're not going to use, but you're going to understand why in the future, okay? We can use a label. For example, the label, it's this part here, it's this first name, okay? It's just a label to explain what the input that we're going to use, it's appearing, okay? The input, it's what we're going to use in the form. The label, it's optional. You don't need to think about. Let me let this way. You don't have to think about, okay? So let me put this the simplest way that we can have, okay, just to see the form. So this is the form. This is just what the form will show. So we have to put the form tag, and inside we have to put the inputs. So the inputs can have a lot of types. Here we have the type task. So if we write here, for example, Giovanna, it's going to understand, okay? Here we have the ID, the name, and the value. So why the value is John? So if you check before, it was showing John. If I erase that and I run again, John is the value. So John is what is appearing in here, okay? And we have the input type submit that creates this button here, okay? And the value, it's what is going to appear for us. So for example, here we have submit, and we can put, I don't know, click here, and when we run, it changes the name. The same idea here. If I put the value Giovanna, it's going to change what is appearing in here, okay? And if we check better the form, here they explain a lot. So here we have a lot of types. So we have type task, type radio, checkbox, submit, button, okay? And each type has a meaning, has a reason to understand. So here they explain every text field. So for example, text field, design a single line input field for text input. They explain the label, all of this. So I recommend you to take a look on this part, okay, to understand better the HTML. So what's the idea in our project? As you can see here, we want to have an input type task, right? Because we want to write a text that it's going to be our task here. So that's what we're going to do. So as we can see on the project, we have the form, okay? So we have to create the form tag. And what we're going to put inside the form. So we're going to have an input text and an input submit, okay? So it's basically this idea here. We're going to use input type task and input type submit. So let's create here input. And what's going to be the input? The input, it doesn't need a closing tag here, okay? We just use the single tag notation in this case. And what we're going to put in our input, so we're going to put type equals text, right? Because this is the type of our input. And we can put an ID here. Right now, let's just put this way. Let's do the simple way here. And we have an input submit, okay? Type equals submit. Let's do first the simple way, and then we can complicate a little. So let's check here. If we run again, it appears here our form, okay? So here we can type anything, hi, and here we have the submit. When I click, nothing happens because we're not explaining where this information here is going to be worked. So where the form data is going to be used, okay? So that's why when we write here something, nothing happens. So this is the structure basically that we're going to use in our project. So, but this, it's not enough, okay? Because as we saw before, if we type here something, so study, I don't know, React, when we submit, nothing happens, right? And our tasks here, how did we create our task? In the source code, okay? And that's not what we want. So now that's where we're going to use the JavaScript part, okay? The JavaScript is going to handle with these problems here. So I'm going to take these parts off. So we've done with the HTML part, okay? Now we're going to work with the tasks. I highly recommend you to take a look here. They also do these notes, the to-do list, okay, in the JavaScript week. I know it seems a little bit confusing because they put different informations in different weeks, but here this video is just for you to understand better how to create a project using HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. That's why we're using a lot of resources, okay? So, okay, now we're going to use the JavaScript, right? And how are we going to use the JavaScript? We have to explain to the compiler where the JavaScript is going to be, which JavaScript file we're going to use. So remember, the head part contains the part that it's not displayed in our web page, okay? But it has the important tools that we're going to use in our code. So here, in order to call the JavaScript file to explain to the compiler where the JavaScript is, we're going to use the link. Okay, so link here. Actually, we're not going to use a link. We're going to see here one thing. So as we can see here, notice below how we leave space for another list. This is not important now. And also notice that we add a link to tasks.js where we will write our JavaScript. So here we have to use this script tag, okay? And we have to explain the source, and the source is the name of the file of the JavaScript that we're going to use. And we have to put this inside the head in order to the compiler understands where we will write our JavaScript code, okay? So here we're going to use a script, and we have to put our source. So source equals to what? It's going to be the name of our JavaScript file, and I'm going to put here Ctrl S. Let's save it as, let's put a name for our project. It's going to be tasks.js, okay? Let me save on our to-do director. So here we're in the source, we're going to put the name of our file, that it's tasks.js, okay? And we have to close the and we have to close here the script tag. So let's save. So by now we're explaining that what we're going to, our JavaScript is going to be handled in the JavaScript file, okay? But now we have to let our HTML prepared for what we're going to do in our tasks.js, okay? So in order to do this, what we're going to do in here, as we can check in our to-do task, we have to let some things prepared, okay? So for example, here we have the heading, we have here the unordered list, we have here the input and the submit button. So as we can think, our code, our JavaScript is going to handle with the form, okay? So everything that we're going to write on the form, it's going to be placed here in the list item of our unordered list. So we have to let our unordered list prepare to this. And how we're going to do this? We're not going to have anymore this list item here, okay? We're just going to let the unordered list set here, okay? But we have to create a name to this unordered list here. We have to create an ID for it. So here we're going to put ID equals tasks, okay? So this part here, I'm going to put a comment, okay? When we want to comment on HTML, we have to use this notation here, and we write on the middle. So this creates an unordered list to display the tasks, and what is going to happen? The JavaScript code will handle the list items, okay? So this is basically the idea. We're just creating the tag unordered list, but the JavaScript, it's going to create the list items that we had before, okay? So by now, if we run this again, we don't have anymore here an unordered list, okay? Why? Because we're not adding something in here, okay? But after we do the project, we're going to have this. Now, what we have to do? We have to create here, we have to put in our input an ID also, Okay, and we're going to put the ID as task, because each input that we're going to put, it's going to be a new task in our tasks. Okay, so everything that we're going to write in here, it's going to be a new task for our tasks or an ordered list that we're going to have. That's why I'm going to give this ID name here. And it's important to give IDs here. Why? Because when we're going to use the JavaScript, we're going to take some elements in our HTML using these IDs, okay? That's why it's important. Here we're gonna put ID submit, right? Because it's a submit part. And what more we have to do? And just this, okay? So if we check here, nothing is happening by now, okay? We're just giving names so the compiler understands. Oh, so when we use here JavaScript, and it's going to think, oh, what is the ID? What is task? So the compiler is going to come to the HTML, it's going to grab the part that has the ID task, and it's going to be handled in here, okay? So by now, it's this our project. Now let's do the JavaScript. Okay, so let's do our tasks.js. I think this is important before we start this part for you to read the part of tasks of JavaScript in the CS50 notes, okay, to understand a little bit how it works. Brian gives a really good example. He explains very well JavaScript, and here we're going to do something more, okay? So the first thing that we have to do is to create an add event listener that is going to be triggered when the page loads, okay? So when the page loads. And why? Because we have to trigger our JavaScript file some way. So when we use this add event listener, we're going to trigger the JavaScript file, and the JavaScript file, everything that we're going to write in the JavaScript file, it's going to work in our HTML file, okay? Now we're going to make a relationship between the task.html and the tasks.js. And I know it seems a little bit overwhelming seeing a lot of tabs open here, okay? But it's important for you to have this habit on searching things on the internet and understand the documentation, because when you are programming, it's always good to search things in internet, okay? This is a unusual habit that we have to have, okay? So don't be overwhelmed, don't be scared with this habit, okay? So the first thing is what? We have to trigger the JavaScript file when the page loads. And how we're going to do this? We're going to use the add event listener method. And the add event listener method attaches an event handler to the specific element, okay? So we're going to start our project here with the add event listener. We're going to use document. Why? The document, here the CSS, he explains a lot. So for example, add event listener, register a single event listener or a single target. The event target may be a single element in a document, the document itself, a window, or something here that we don't need to know by now. So we are grabbing here, we're putting the document because we want to trigger the document, okay? And the add event listener will be what? So where it's the event handler to a specific element, okay? The specific element, it's the whole document, and the event handler will be what? When the page loads. And when the page loads, it's this thing here, DOM content loaded event. So the DOM content load event fires when the initial HTML document has been completed loaded, okay? So this is what we're going to write in our project here. So DOM content loaded, okay? And now we're going to write inside what we're going to do in our project, okay? So everything that is inside this add event listener, it's going to happen after the page loads, okay? So we are initializing our project. Now we're going to start our code working with the input part, okay? Because why? We want to handle with this form action, right? Because in here we're not using the form action. Do you remember when I showed to you the action that appears inside the form. So we're going to work with this information here, the form, okay? So first thing that we have to do is to grab this form information here. So how do we grab a specific element in the HTML to be used in the JavaScript? We use the HTML DOM query selector. So the query selector methods return the first element that matches a specified CSS selector in the document. So in this case, we can use what? We can use the tag itself, okay? Or we can use this ID here that we implement later, before in our HTML file, okay? So since we're going to work with the form, why we're going to work with the form? Because we have to do an add event listener in the form for when the submit here is clicked, okay? So that's why we're going to grab this form information. So we're going to select the form tag in HTML, okay, to be used in the add event listener of submit. So we're going to create this, okay? So how do we grab this form tag in the HTML? We're going to initialize our form as a constant, okay? This is how we create variables. We can create variables using const or let or var, depending on your purpose. And one thing that is important, you see here that we have this parsing error, unexpected token. This means that we have to close our function using this semicolon here, okay? In JavaScript, we have to close the lines with semicolon, like in C language. So here we are initializing a variable called form, and in this form, we're going to attach the value of our element form here, okay? So how are we going to do this? We're going to use the query selector, okay? So here in task.js, we're going to use document.query selector, okay? And what the CS50 explains to us. So returns the first element that is a descendant of the element on which is invoked that matches the specific group of selectors. So here we're going to write what element in the HTML document where we want to grab. So in this case, we want to grab the form, and the form has tag form. So here we're going to write inside form, okay? And we're going to write this in here. Now we want to create the add event listener when the submit, when we want to submit the form. So this situation here, situation is what? Submit a new task, okay? So to submit a new task, we're going to use the add event listener, and instead of using the document, now we want to use what? We want to use the form. So form.add event listener. So we're going to register a single event listener on a single target. So the single target here is the form, okay? And we're going to use the event listener for the form. So the event target may be a single element in a document, the document itself, or blah, blah, blah. So in this case, the event target is the element in a document. And in this case, it's the form that we already grabbed in here, okay? And what's going to be the event that we're going to work? So in here, we saw the DOM content loaded, right? This was the event when the page loads, but now the event is when the submit button is clicked, okay? And how are we going to do this? First, we're going to select the submit button, okay? In the HTML, we have to do this relationship, and then we're going to add here as the event. So here we're going to select the submit ID in HTML to be used as event in the add event listener, okay? And we're going to do the same way. So we have to start a variable called submit. And what's the value of the submit? We're going to use the query selector to grab this submit here. So how do we describe this submit input? We use here as ID submit, okay? So in the previous case, we grabbed the tag form, but now we're going to grab the ID submit, okay? So that's what we're going to do. Here we're going to use document.query selector, and what we're going to put inside the submit. We have to use the hash because we're grabbing the ID, okay? So we're grabbing the ID submit. Then that we create this ID submit, we're going to use this as the event handler in here, as the event that is going to trigger this add event listener inside, okay? So what's the event? It's the submit that we create here. And now we're going to open and close the parentheses, and we're going to do our function inside. So everything that is inside this add event listener, it's going to be inside here, okay? Remember, we have to close here with a semicolon, and everything that it's about the submit a new task is going to be inside this form add event listener, okay? So the first thing we're going to do is what? When we go here in our input, so let's see this example. When we write something in the input here, we want to what? We want to write an input, click submit, and this is going to appear as a list item in here, okay? So this is what we're going to do. So the first thing that we have to think is what? We have to create this list item, because as we saw previously, we just created the unordered list. The JavaScript code will handle the list item, okay? So now let's work with this handling the list item. And how we're going to do this? We have a function in JavaScript that creates an element in the HTML. So we can create the create element methods, create an element with the specified name. So for example here, let's try this ourselves. When we use this function create element, it's going to create a button, okay? I know it seems confusing, it's a lot of code in here, but the idea is what? When we click the button, it's going to create a new button, okay? So when we click, it's going to create a new button. When we click here, nothing happens because we're creating an element in the make button element here. So when we put the try it, we're going to create buttons, okay? Every time we click this button, it's going to create a new element in the HTML. That's what we're going to do. But instead of creating a button, we're going to create what? We're going to create a list item, right? That is going to be inside our unordered list. This list item, it's what? It's this part here. It's our tasks. So let's start this. So we're going to create what? We're going to create I'm going to write here, create a list item on HTML. Okay, this is the part that we're going to do. To create a list item, we're going to define a variable called li, okay, and we're going to use this notation here, create a element, and what element we're going to create. So document, why document? Because we're creating things on the HTML. Document.create element, and what's going to be the tag that we want to create. Since we want to create a list item, the tag is what? Is li. Okay, close with semicolon. And now that we're creating the list item, what we want to be the value of the list item? The task that we're using as input. So first we have to grab the value of this task here, and then we have to insert this value in the li. So we're going to do this here. So we have to do this relationship. So grab the value of the task that was given by the user as the user inputs, okay? And how we're going to do this? So this part here, we're doing the relationship between the task.js and the task.html. So how we're going to grab the value of the task? We're going to do exactly as we did with the form and the submit. We're going to use the query selector, but in this case, what is the ID that we're going to grab? The ID task, okay? Because this ID task is holding the value of the inputs that the user give as a new task, okay? So we're going to create a new variable as let new task. And why let? Let, it's one way of creating a new variable, okay? And we're going to put let new task, and we're going to use the document dot query selector. And what's the ID of our new task here? It's the task, right? It's this ID because we're grabbing this input here. So we're going to put here hash task, okay? Close here. So now what we're going to do, we're going to add, I'm going to write here, add the new task value to the list item, okay? So we're going to grab the new task value that we're going to receive from the user inputs, and we're going to store this in, oops, let me just make this right, and we're going to store this in the list item, okay? That's what we're going to do in here. Let me just see one thing. I think I made a mistake here with the indentation. Okay, now this is right. So we're going to add the new task value to the list item. So we're going to use what? We're going to use this new thing here that is called inner HTML property. The inner HTML property sets or return the HTML content of an element. So the idea is what? When we type, we click here. So I know it seems confusing, a lot of things written in here, but the idea is when we click to change this thing here, so the idea is getting the element by demo, and the element call with demo, with ID demo, it's the paragraph. So when we click here, it's going to change this whole statement to paragraph change it, okay? That's what we're going to do. The inner HTML is going to change the content in the HTML. So since we want to set the new task value to the list item, we're going to do this. So li, that is the name of our constant here that we are creating a list item on HTML, dot inner HTML, okay? And what we're going to write in the inner HTML, we're going to set the new task value, okay? The new task here, and since we want to grab the value of the new task, we want to put dot value. So by now we are adding the new task value to the list item, but we have to append the list item to some part in the project, right? Because by now we are creating a new element, but we don't know, the compiler doesn't know where he has to put this list item in here. So that's why we're going to append this list item to this UL tag here. So remember, here we're going to create the relationship between the JavaScript and the HTML. So select the UL in the HTML to attach the new task value list item, okay? So in here we're going to do what? We're going to do const UL. And what's the const UL? We're going to use the query selector to grab this part here of HTML, and we're going to do something inside. So here we're going to use the document dot query selector, and what it's going to be the element that we're grabbing. We can use our UL tag or the ID tasks, okay? Because UL tag here it's unique, so we can use the UL tag, or we can use the ID tasks. We're going to use the ID task because we created these IDs for a reason. So we're going to put here hash tasks, okay? So by now we're grabbing the UL here, and now we're going to do what? We're going to append this list item information inside the unordered list in our HTML. So we are explaining to the compiler where he has to put this list item, okay? So let's put this here. So append the list item to unordered list. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. We're going to call ul, that is our const here, and we're going to use append. And what we're going to append inside? The li, right? The list item that we created. So by now, if we check here our to-do, if we write here, for example, study JavaScript, we submit, and it's going to appear here, right, our new task. So by now it's working, but you see here that after we submit, what we just wrote keeps here in the input task. So we don't want this. We want this to be erased in each time we submit. So that's why we're going to clear the value of new task variable and set it to empty. And how we're going to do this? This is kind of seems confusing by this time, but it's a powerful tool that we're going to use. So we're going to clear the value of new task, because we already put this in our list item, okay, and of our new task variable, and set it to empty. Okay, and how we're going to do this? So since here we have the new task is the value that we are writing here, so for example, study HTML. This is the value of our new task, right? So now we're going to set this new value dot task equals to empty. So new task dot value, and we're going to set this to empty. Okay, so let's save it and let's see what happens. So if we write here let me refresh the page, and you see when we refresh the page, it clears out. Okay, don't worry, when we check on CS50 they expect us to do this. So for example, study JavaScript, and when we click submit, what happens? Nothing. And we're going to understand why. Okay, so the idea, by now we are setting this as value empty, okay? And why this is not refreshing? Because we have a problem here that we're going to handle with the prevent default method, event method. And what does the prevent default event method does? The prevent default method cancels the event if it's cancelable, meaning that the default action that belongs to the event will not occur. For example, and this is what's happening with our problem, clicking on a submit button prevents it from submitting a form. So you see here that when we submit, nothing happens. So what is happening? It keeps submitting like in a for loop. So it so this prevent default submission of the form involves either reloading the current page or redirecting to the another one. So we know that this is making our code crash, okay? So here in the beginning, we're going to use what? We're going to use the prevent listener, the prevent default. And to put the prevent default, we have to put here as event, okay? It's just a way to pass as an input to our function as event, and here we're going to put event.prevent default. Okay, so let's save here and let's refresh here to check what's happening. Okay, so when we type here study JavaScript and when we click submit, so why nothing is happening? Because here I put append and not append. So let's save here and we're going to see again. So we have to refresh the page, study JavaScript, and when I click submit, it appends in here, okay? So this prevent default method prevents the default submission of our form. So as we saw here, after we write here our task, our input become empty again. So for example, study HTML. When we click submit, our input returns to be empty, okay? That's what our new task.value is doing. So by now, everything is working really fine, right? But we have one more thing to make our to-do app really great. So this thing is what? Is to make so as we can see here, for example, if we have nothing here, we can click submit and it's going to put a task empty, but we don't want this to happen. We want our task to be write something. So we're going to handle with this problem here. So here we're going to use the add event listener to hand. So the situation here, it's what? Submit an empty value. And how we're going to handle this? We're going to work with the part that it's called, where I put here, that it's called key up event. So the key up event is fired when a key is released. So the idea here is what? We just want this submit to happen if we set here in our input something. We don't want to have an empty task, okay? And how we're going to do this? We're going to work with the disable and enable button. So as you can see here, when we have nothing, our submit is disabled, but when we write something, our submit is enabled. Okay, and that's the part that we're going to use. So how we're going to work with this? We're not going to work with the submit button, but we're going to work with the new task value. Okay, so this is the add event listener that we're going to use. So new task dot add event listener. And what's the type of our, so what's the event that it's going to trigger this add event listener here? It's this key up. So when we write this key up means when we write something, this add event listener is going to be triggered, okay? So that's the idea. When we write something, our button will be enabled to be clicked, okay? So this is key up, okay? And open and close parentheses equals here, open curly brackets. Don't forget to close with the semicolon, okay? And in here, what we're going to do? We're going to work with able or disable button. So here we're going to write, when there is nothing typed in the input, okay, turns the submit button disable, okay? And the other condition will be what? When there is something typed in the input, turns the submit button enable, okay? So as we saw here, we have two conditions, so we're going to use if and else. So we're going to use if the new task equals is 3 equals in JavaScript is empty. So if there is nothing typed, so if new task is empty, what we're going to do? We're going to submit. And why we're writing submit? Because it understands that we're working with the submit button. We're going to click submit disabled equals to true, okay? And the else case is going to be what? It's going to be, we're going to set the submit dot disable equals to false, okay? These are the two things that we have to do. But we have to do one last thing to finish our JavaScript. We have to set the button in here, okay? So for example, after we're doing the whole submit part here, we have to set our button as what? As disable, okay? So here we're going to put disable button because the new task value is empty, okay? So we're going to put what? Submit dot disable equals to true, okay? So now let's check if our code, our project is running okay. So let's reload here, and we're going to write study JavaScript, and we click submit and submit it. And after we submit, what we see here in our button. This is disabled, right? Because there's nothing right. But when we put a letter, it already turns this enable. So let's put here study HTML and we click submit, okay? And when we write something, so study CSS, that is our last part of this project, okay? So by now this is working fine, so our JavaScript is working really well. Now we're going to work with the design, so let me close these tabs here because we're not going to use it, okay? And now our project is running okay, everything is working, but now we're going to work with the CSS, okay? So we're going to work with the style of our project. And here, let me go to the CSS part. That is what? When we are using CSS, we have to put, as we use in the JavaScript, we have to explain to the compiler where our CSS file will be. We can use the CSS inside here, okay? Or we can use the CSS, we can grab and we can explain that our CSS will be in a link, okay? So that's what we're going to do. So by now this task is okay, we're not going to use. But in here, in the head part, we have to explain where our CSS is going to be. So here we have to use link, okay? ahref equals to the name of the file that we're going to create, and rel equals to style sheet, okay? And what's going to be our href? It's going to be the name of our file. And what's going to be the name? So I'm going to call styles.css, okay? We're going to put in this directory, and in here we're going to put what? Styles.css. It has to be the same name. So by now we're explaining that our styles.css will handle with the style of our project here. We're going to do some things in the styles.css and some things using the Bootstrap, okay? But by now let's start with the styles.css. So for example, if we see here in our page, we have the tasks in here, but what if we want to change our tasks and put this in a, and we want to change this heading here, we put this in a text align in a center or change the color. So we're going to do this. So first we can use the styles.css calling by the tag, or we can create an ID, or we can create a class, okay? I think you already saw this in the notes of CS50, but it's interesting to take a look. So by now we're going to work with the h1, okay? So here we're going to put h1. And what I want to create in our h1, I want to do first, for example, text align. And let's put this on the center. Okay, so text align here, we have a lot of examples. Here again, Double3 Schools has a really good documentation about CSS. So you can see here we have a lot of properties, okay? But in this case, we're going to use the text align. The text align, let's see this example. We have this whole example. So we have the text align center. So this is in the center. We have text align on the left, on the right, or justified, okay? So we can work with these things. So in here, I'm going to put text align center. I'm going to save it. And when I reload the page, where is going to be our tasks? Align to the center, okay? Or we can change the color, for example. So color, I don't know, blue. If we run our code again, it's blue, but I want to let this as gray, okay? So I'm going to put this here gray, and when we run this, it's gray, okay? Now we can work with what? We can work with creating a class, okay? The class we can call as class style. So for example, if I want to put, so we see here that it's right on the left and it's making things really close to the left margin, okay? But, or for example, if we put here study JavaScript, it makes right next in the top margin. So we can make this margin be larger, okay? And how can we do this? We can create a div, for example. So I'm going to create a div, here, div, with name class equals container style. Okay, we're going to create a container. And we have to close this div. What's going to be inside this div? Our h1. And we're going to close our div here. Okay, so close div. And we're going to save. And what we're going to want to do in this container style, we're going to work with these margins here. So let's see the margins. We have margin top, right, and bottom. So for example, this paragraph here, it's kind of in the middle. So this div element has top margin 100 pixels, right margin blah blah blah, and we're using this margin top, margin bottom, blah blah blah, and you can give these margins in here in the 4 directions, in these 2 directions, x and y. Okay, so that's what we're going to do in here. So in the styles, since we create a class, we have to use the dot. Okay, so dot container style. We're going to put what? We're going to put margin bottom, for example, 5 pixels, margin top 50 again. I'm going to put all 50, okay? Margin left 50 and margin right 50 again. So let's check what happens. When we run this again, we're seeing here that we have this margin top, margin blah blah blah, and we're going to put the same in where? We're going to do the same in the we're going to do the same in this div here of the form, okay? Because we want the form to be not close to the task here, okay? So we're going to do the same. Since we're creating a class, the class we can use in different places. Okay, let me just see. So yes, here we can put all margin, or we can put just as this suggests here, the property margin top, margin bottom, margin left, margin right can be replaced by margin. So we can put all this in one margin, just one margin, okay? As we can see here. So we're going to put the same thing in the form. We're going to create a div. So div, everything has to be inside, so remember the indentation, okay? And in here we're going to put the div, the closing div. Since we're using a class, the class can be used in different places. If it was an ID, it has to be unique, but since it's a class, we can use in a different place. So style container.style. And when we refresh here, we're going to see that it has this purpose here, okay? So we can see that it's not anymore in the left style here. But we can do something different. We can make this greater. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to put here margin top this way, and margin left, I'm going to put this, for example, 300, just to check. Okay, so when we refresh here, we're going to see that everything goes to the left here, okay? But since we don't want this, I'm going to take this out, and we're going to leave this here as margin 50 pixels, okay? So I'm going to separate my actually I'm not, I'm going to put everything together here. So we're having this by now, okay? So actually I'm going to take this style container, I'm going to put ID here, ID style container style heading, okay? Or we can just take this out and use everything on the heading. So I'm going to make some changes here. I'm going to put here margin 50 pixels, okay? And let's put here the to do. So we have the margin on the center, okay? But we're going to change the margin in here. So the margin left is going to be what? It's going to be, I don't know, 500. And let's check how it goes. So it's basically almost in the middle. We can work with the margin left, or we can use the items align and things like that. So it's basically in the middle. I'm going to put 600, okay? And when we do this in here, it's basically align. Actually, let me change here. This is not so worth it. You can use the align items, okay? So it's basically in the middle. And we want to change the margin top. Why? Because when we write something in here, for example, study JavaScript, it's going to put in really next to each other, okay? So here we're going to put margin top 550 pixels, and when we run this again, it makes a larger style in here. So we can use this by now as a CSS, okay? CSS text align, CSS margin, and so on and so forth. I'm going to take out the margin by now, okay? I'm going just to left this margin as 50 pixels, okay? I was just mixing here just for you to check what normally works. I'm going to take out this this text align. I was just playing with the task just for you to check how to use CS50. But now we use the CSS, how to use the CSS, okay? But now that we use the CSS, we can use another powerful tool to create different styles that it's called Bootstrap, okay? So build fast, responsive sites with Bootstrap. You can use Bootstrap in your problems. And how you use this? You have to copy and paste this style sheet link into the head before all the style sheets to load our CSS. So if you want to grab, if we have to use the Bootstrap, we click here, copy, okay, on the Bootstrap documentation, and we're going to paste this in here, okay? I know it seems enormous, but it's important, okay? Because it's saying what? The things that we're going to use on the Bootstrap, it's in this link here, okay? And now that we explained, we're grabbing this thing, we're going to start, for example, changing our button. So as we can see here, our button is a kind of sad, right? But we can change this using different types of buttons. So if you want to change the style of the button, you come here, you copy the class that you want. For example, we want to grab the button with this color primary. So we're going to grab the btn primary. And we're going to paste this inside the input of the submit. So if we save this here and we reload, what we're going to have? We're going to check that our button is going to change to this color here. And if you want to change the color, so for example, yellow, we're going to grab the warning class. So copy here the warning class and paste where you want. Okay, so save it. And when we reload here, it's going to change the color. Okay, we can do more than that. We can put, for example, we can put things in a container. Okay, actually, let's do the container later. We can change the form to something better than this. So as we can see here, it's all black and in a different way, but we can use this way here. You see, kind of a light gray here. So we can grab in the form this form control, okay, so class form control. And what the class form control is going to work with this, with our input, so it's going to make this a different way, okay? So in the input task, we're going to put here the class form control, and if we run here, we're going to see a difference here. So we can see that it's grabbing the whole line, okay? The submit button is in here. We can jump a line using BR, okay? For example, this is a trick that we can use when we want to make this space in here, okay? Or we can put all of this in one place only, so we can use a div, and it's going to be all inside. So for example, div, it's going to be all in one line. So div, and when we jump a line and we use in here, we're going to see what? The same thing. So you can forget what I said. For example, let me check here. We can use the form group, the class form group. and it's going to make, I forgot to do this, so class form group, we can go to put this in this part, and when we reload this again, nothing happens by now, but it makes in a nice way of doing this. We can use label, okay, to explain what this means, or we can use a placeholder. Like in here we have this enter email, we can use a placeholder with this saying to the user what is happening, so we can make things easier. So for example, here we can put placeholder, and what we can say, so add new task. And where this add new task is going to appear, so instead of this being empty, it's going to have this add a new task in here, okay? So we can add JavaScript, and now it's enabled, okay? So let's see what I forgot to do. One thing we'll make this out later. And we have containers, so if we want to put things in a container, so for example we want to put our list items in a container, we can use this class container here, okay? So let's put this our UL in a container, so we can create here div, and container is something that the Bootstrap understands that it means it is implementation. So if we put here div class equals container, let's see what happens. So when we run this again, we can put here study JavaScript, and it's going to be better. Can you see? It's kind of in a different way, or study HTML, and it's going to appear nicer here. And we can see we can use different ways of Bootstrap, okay? You can check this later. We have like a enormous number of things that we can do, okay? So I highly recommend you to check this out. And we saw here that we have one last problem to make this right. When we reload the page, the submit button is enabled, so we have to change this. I forgot to do in our test.js. I forgot to set as default here our button as disabled, okay? So we just have to make this right. So it's always good for you to check when you do something wrong, because you can think on how to work this out. So for example, here it's disabled, so if we put here, it's going to put an empty task, but we don't want this, right? We create here a submit an empty value, blah blah blah, but we have to give a default when the page loads. So the default case when the page loads, the button has to be disabled, okay? So that's what we're going to do. We're going to catch the submit dot disable, disabled, and we're going to set this equals true, okay? So when we reload here, we're going to check what? That when we reload the page, this is disabled, and then our project is running, okay? So study JavaScript, study HTML, study CSS, and don't forget Bootstrap, okay? So this is our task to do app from using JavaScript, HTML, CSS, and Bootstrap. I hope you enjoyed this content, and see you in the next video. Bye bye.